Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. That was the work of my friend down in Texas, Doug Bryan, put that animated film together with me to promote the revised edition of my Silver Age book. Let's go back to my cover there. Skip too fast. But my revised edition that came out in 2014, and it's about comic book art in the 1960s and how it reflected what was happening in the decade through the work of the 8 artists who I believe, in the same way we look back on the Renaissance masters like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael, I think future art historians 500 years from now are going to look back on these artists as the giants who walked the earth in our time of the human figure and of comic book art. I tried to match a quote from each artist that kind of describe what they felt about their art. Colan said, every story I ever drew was like being the director of a film. And the films that inspired him when he was a kid growing up in Brooklyn and New York City was the Universal monster films of the early 30s, Frankenstein, 31, Karloff, Bela Lugosi, the same year, Dracula, 1941, Lon Chaney as the Wolfman. Those films, to hear Colan describe it, affected him more than anything and put those cinematic ideas in his head. And in the same way that the Wolfman, in a sense, was a mask, it was the mask of Iron Man that became one of Colan's most iconic characters, though he himself did not design the red and yellow Iron Man design. And then, of course, there's Doctor Strange. This is Steve Ditko, his last issue in 1966. It really wasn't until Gene Colan started illustrating him in 1968 that we get a post-Ditko version of Doctor Strange to equal Ditko's, and maybe that's even controversial. And then there's the Marvel hero Daredevil, that again, though Colan did not create him or even design his costume, his red suited version became the definitive version of the character in the Silver Age in the 1960s, along with Iron Man and Doctor Strange. These are just three of what I call the marvelous milieus, just like that the alliteration, of Gene Colan. Gene Colan, as a comic book artist breaking in the late 40s and early 50s, he did, like a lot of the artists of his time, multiple genres, like war comics. Look at his signature on the lower left in white in the black background above the on sale every month. You can just make out Colan's name. This, of course, looks nothing like the modern mature style that you know of Gene Colan. And the comics that I could find to show you show, you know, next to nothing of what you would come to think of as the mature Colan style. But through the 50s and other genres, you began to see hints, or more than hints, of the future Colan mature style, more suited to mystery stories like this. And he wished he was a vampire. Talk about portents of Colan's 1970s career. But there's his signature, and look at this wacky page with the art down below. He wound up at DC Comics in the late 50s, early 60s. He's doing their romance line, and his affinity for drawing beautiful women you can see in a more primitive state in this early 60s issue of Young Love. He also did features like Sea Devils. Now, this is not his cover. This is the DC workhorse Irv Novick, and it's one of the painted covers by DC head colorist Jack Adler. But if we look in the interior art, you can see that early 60s Gene Colan was not quite the mature Gene Colan yet either. But interesting in the story of the undersea group, what do we have down here below but a meta panel? I'm Gene Colan. DC sent me to draw your next adventure. I've been practicing scuba diving, so I wouldn't be in your way. Okay with you? Wow. Yeah, I mean, this is what's great about, you know, early 60s or all Silver Age DC is just the utter wackiness of it. I mean, you know, it was great that they were doing this, and that's the whole story. Gene, think you can get it all down? Once I stop gulping my heart, watch me. I don't know who wrote the story, Bob Haney, whoever was doing Sea Devils. But Colan then also worked for Marvel in the early 60s. This is dated June of 1962, right after the Fantastic Four come out. There's also all these monster and science fiction titles, Strange Tales. This is a Jack Kirby cover. He was doing so many of their what were called monster books in the pre-superhero era. But even in this story, you can see the more mature Colan style developing, especially with his use of blacks and shadows. But look at this double page spread, and look at the white space on the upper left in the white border. The Hulk will amaze you. This was Marvel's idea of promoting their forthcoming comic book, The Hulk. But yeah, look at the GENE COLAN art, and you can see this is, you know, early 60s GENE COLAN, not the GENE COLAN fully born. But in a lot of the art, I like the left-hand page's bottom right panel. And look at on sale soon, The Hulk. Okay, The Hulk. Here was the first issue, dated May of 62. Of course, the Hulk is colored gray. That's a whole story I won't go into because I want to keep the pace going. The Hulk would, after having a couple issues of his own title, would resurface in 1964, splitting the book Tales to Astonish with the character then known as Giant Man. He would eventually become Ant-Man, or he was Ant-Man, then he becomes Ant-Man again, Yellow Jack. Who can keep up with the Marvel genealogy? But suffice to say, by the following year, August of 1965, no more Giant Man. He's replaced. The Hulk is the backup story, but the lead story, with a Jack Kirby cover, of course, is going to be the Submariner. Now, the Submariner was brought back in Fantastic Four #4 in the spring of 1962. Yeah, I wonder where, you know, Gene Roddenberry got the idea for Spock from, right? But yeah, so Kirby in the early 60s is sort of the Submariner, the de facto Submariner artist. I mean, by 1964, when I think this pinup was done, he is the de facto vision of the early 60s Submariner until he had his own feature. So imagine our surprise when this is the art that we got. A whole new vision of the Submariner. Wow. By the way, this is mid-1965. For a couple months, Marvel rebranded itself as Pop Art Productions. This was at the height of the Roy Lichtenstein early pop art zeitgeist. But yeah, there's the art to GENE COLAN's first cover. If we strip away the color, you can see these are the inks of the Marvel mainstay Vince Colletta, which we're going to talk about further. Here's the first splash page. Now, these aren't the best reproductions I could get you. These are not scans of the actual printed pages. I couldn't get my hands on them. So this is the best I could find on the internet. They don't do it much service, but hey, it's the best I could bring you, so pardon me. Notice he's billed as Adam Austin, not GENE COLAN, because right at that time, no artist could work at both DC or Marvel. You had to kind of be exclusive. But if you moonlighted, you used the pseudonym. And that wasn't broken until 1960, late 66 or early 67, when Gil Kane went to Marvel after being years at DC, and he was billed as Gil Kane. But Adam Austin with inking by Vince Colletta. Now, without going into a whole Vince Colletta diatribe, suffice it to say, he's the most controversial inker in comics. And while this is not a great reproduction, it still just shows you why we are still arguing to this day over the quality or lack thereof of Vince Colletta's inks. Now, some of these early covers by Colan, his strong penciling and composition made up for instance, look at Under Submariner's left arm and how the shading flattens out his entire arm. But the whole cover itself is a magnificent early Colan cover. But then you'd get splash pages like this, which again, while it's not the best reproduction, there it is in black and white. Again, this is the best resolution for a webinar I could find. But regardless, when you look at a page like this, I don't want to get detoured, but if you look at the way Coletta chooses to ink on Submariner's left arm, on his right arm, I mean, again, I don't want to get bogged down, but look at the difference between a Vince Coletta inked Gene Colan circa 1965, and now look at the inks of the great Bill Everett, who created the Submariner in 1939 or 40, I think 39, I guess. Look at this page, which I only have to show you in black and white because I wanted you to stress on how beautiful an inker Bill Everett was. Look at these figures of the Submariner. This was what we were not seeing with Vince Coletta inks. Beautiful, am I right? Motion. Just the male figure and all its beauty. Look at this full page by Everett in terms of his inks with Colan. And then there's this issue. A meeting of the two characters Gene Colan was drawing at the same time. Iron Man, of course, who had been created by Jack Kirby back in 1963. He designed the character and illustrated the first cover. But, you know, an issue later, they're already coloring him gold. And by issue 48, December of 64, they're switching from the gold bulky Iron Man to the red and yellow design that you've come to know of as the modern Iron Man. And who designed it? Not Gene Colan. That is Steve Ditko, the man who created Spider-Man. And, you know, even though this is in its simplest form, it is nevertheless the basic design that all modern Iron Men, including the cinematic ones, have followed. But the red and yellow suited Iron Man was immediate success, and he was given the co-lead feature with a draped Jack Kirby cover in November of 64, splitting it with Kirby's Captain America as the co-feature. Kirby always drew a great red and yellow Iron Man, though. But the interior Iron Man artist was the mainstay, Don Heck, very controversial artist. He was like the Mike Sikowski of Marvel, or Sikowski was the Don Heck of DC. But they were artists who were drawing superhero features, and they had many detractors. But again, while we were getting these great Jack Kirby covers at that time, inked by Wally Wood, by the way, the interior was Don Heck. Now, I've got a soft spot for the dot-headed Iron Man, as I call him. But while there's a charm to Don Heck's Iron Man, and there's a charm to Don Heck's art in general, it wasn't until late 1965 that Adam Austin, as you can see in the credits below, took over the Iron Man feature. Now, this was an Iron Man, a whole other level from Don Heck. This was an Iron Man with power, befitting a character called Iron Man. But at the same time, Colan was able to give us an Iron Man in repose, the man inside the mask, the man inside the armor. His first Iron Man cover is one of beauty, action, and stillness at the same time. And all that beautiful early mid-60s Marvel type design is just gorgeous, right? Look at this full page in that issue and how Colan delineates the difference between the classic Iron Men of antiquity and our Iron Man. And he just shows a fluidity of motion with the human figure, both large and small. I mean, look at this full page composition with all of these multiple Iron Man figures. There's the black and white art. By the way, Gary Michaels is yet another pseudonym for the inker Jack Abel, who at the time was working over at DC, I guess, and yet he would wind up working for Marvel for decades after this as Jack Abel. So, but look at this figure as I show it to you in color and we come in close. This 1965 figure ended up being repurposed by Marvel into posters that look like, not posters, I mean, this was a full page pinup in the comic books themselves. But then again, look at this figure and how it was re-illustrated in pen and ink by Marie Severin, the great Marvel Comics artist and colorist. And then color was added to the black plate. And this was the poster I misstated before. 24 by 36. Marvel in 1965 put out 8 of them. And they're all based on the original artists that Marie Severin would, in a sense, re-illustrate in pen and ink over them. There was never anything like them before and nothing like them ever since. There was a bit of a bait and switch in the way it was presented in the comic books, because in the ads that you sent away your money for, they used the actual original artists, as you can see, which we thought we were getting. So those posters, I think, are still being argued over whether people like them or don't to this day in my Facebook groups on the Silver Age and on Jack Kirby. But I digress. Back to Iron Man. So we get to this issue in the summer of 1965. I think I have my dates right. Maybe 1960. No, what am I saying? It's 66. Colan started him in late 65. So yes, and here's a nice close-up of a great fight scene between Colan's 2 characters at Marvel at the time. Now, notice the difference in inks. I think we're back to, I don't know if this is Coletta. It's not the best reproduction, but it was a crossover to Tales to Astonish. And in this particular issue, it begins Gene Colan. Now he's being called Gallant Gene. And I'm not sure who's inking these first 2 pages. This is the difference between a newsprint reproduction, and the only reproduction I could find for the second page is from one of the lousy reprints. But Colan came down with the flu or something, and he couldn't complete the issue. And who stepped in? None other than Jack Kirby himself. And I believe the inks might be by George Tuska. But if you've never seen this issue, it is a primer by Kirby on the essential dynamics, the brutalism of the Kirby style that made Marvel what it is today. And this type of art goes on for, you know, another 10 pages, and it's pretty mind-blowing. But back to Colan, who was incorporating, like so many of the other artists in Marvel and DC, were Kirby's dynamics into their style. I mean, look at this cover by Colan. I mean, this was so influential on a lot of young artists at the time. Walt Simonson, the great Walt Simonson, in 1984, I believe, is doing this cover that he always said was an homage to the great Gene Colan cover, where Iron Man is smashing Titanium Man. Even the splash page is incredibly dynamic. And at this point, Frank Giacoia, longtime Marvel inker, inked a lot of Jack Kirby's work. He's inking Colan, but I always believed he had a heavy hand on Colan, and I never quite liked it. But, you know, your mileage may vary. There's a nice sequence in this issue where Iron Man uses his roller skates and Colan pulls every action scene off. Yeah, that's the thing about Colan's Iron Man. A lot of energy, a lot of just great, almost abstract figure work. Colan, as you can see on the right panel, like that composition of the camera sort of in the bottom left of the panel, looking up at a figure with smaller figures in the distance. It's a composition he often used. Now, while this might not be the best black and white reproduction, nevertheless, you can see what I mean by the heavy hand of Giacoia. But listen, you know, once you add color, it's a whole other ballgame, and, you know, your mileage may vary. But this particular story is significant, 1967, for one of the great full pages that Colan has. It might be the only one of a single solitary figure like this, but it's the one that Colan, later on in my book, I'll tell you, talks about incorporating Kirby's dynamics into his own style. Now, of course, this is based on the Samson image from, you know, the old Bible stories of bringing down the pillars of the temple while he was blinded and in chains. But this is a Norman Rockwell of the actor Victor Mature, who at the time, circa 1954, maybe 58, sometime, is doing Samson and Delilah. And, you know, maybe this is what was inspiring Jack Kirby in 1965 to do this cover, inked by Vince Colletta, by the way. But yeah, it's these dynamics of Kirby's that heavily influenced Marvel artists like Gene Colan to try to get that into their style. This particular image ended up being used as one of those Marvel black light posters that they put out circa 1967, 68. They've recently reproduced them. That's where I got this image from. But, you know, when you look at even the so-called black light, more psychedelic version, you know, to me, I think the original in its original coloring is still the best version of that image. Colan also got a chance to do the bulky gold Iron Man in this particular story, the Golden Ghost. And I think everybody got a kick out of seeing Colan in his style doing the bulky gold Iron Man. He also got to take Iron Man to Vietnam, which is a classic icon of the Marvel 60s and how they reflected what was happening at the time. This is, again, I think early 1968, maybe. Kirby, you know, a couple of years before in 65, was sending his characters to Vietnam. This is June of 65, I believe. And in Captain America, I think the year before, this is 64, with the great bold magic marker contour outlines of Chick Stone, Kirby's 1964 inker. So there was a precedent, and this is what made you know, the Marvel heroes hipper to the counterculture was stories like this within the vastness of Vietnam. There's a nice full page of Iron Man shaking him down. Nice figure there. And how about that graphic at the bottom right? Yeah, that's what Gene Colan brought to Iron Man. This was the last issue of Tales of Suspense, March 68, of Iron Man and Captain America sharing a title, because the next month there would be the one-shot of Iron Man teaming up with Submariner and sharing the issue. Now, the inks for this cover are by the great Bill Everett, but they're not my favorite. I mean, Submariner's body is a little wacko, and I don't know what's going on with Iron Man's right knee, but nevertheless, this one-shot team up was then to prepare the two of them to spin off in their own titles, and Gene Colan draws the cover of Iron Man #1 as one of his, if not his greatest single Iron Man icon. I'm lowering it here in frame to show you how the original art originally looked in black and white. Now, I think these are Giacoya inks. I'm not sure though. Could it be Vince Coletta? I should have checked. Nevertheless, it was, of course, the helmet that Colan really owned, because there's a sympathy to this character. You can sense the human being under the iron mask, and that tilt of the head that Colan always would come back to is the one that made him the definitive Iron Man artist of the Silver Age. I mean, there was a magnificence, there was a tragedy to the heroicness of Iron Man that Colan was able to capture in that helmet, even though he did not design the character at all. Similar to his Daredevil. I mean, this is one of his most iconic covers because it gets across his civilian identity of Matt Murdock, a lawyer, and it also shows Daredevil's original costume. This is, by the way, June of 1968, whereas here is Daredevil's first issue in April of 64, with a cover by Kirby of a character that Bill Everett designed. I think Bill Everett might have inked this cover. But there's Daredevil's original kind of semi-boxer inspired outfit designed by, well, I'm not sure whether it was Kirby or Everett, but it wasn't until issue 7 in 1965 that the great Wally Wood design, that is the essential red and yellow devil outfit that Daredevil still sports to this day. But Wood was only there until issue 10 or so. And then the next couple issues were by John Romita, who, as you can see in this May of 1966 crossover, it was really a training ground to prepare him to take over the post-Ditko Spider-Man. And who would replace John Romita on Daredevil? Yep, that would be your Gene Colan. At this point, he is no longer Adam Austin after Gil Kane, I think, got there in 1966. Pseudonyms were a thing of the past. So here's an early Gene Colan. Oh, well, there's still a pseudonym. Mickey Demio was Mike Esposito. Over at DC, he was part of the Ross Andru, Mike Esposito art team. But when he inked for Marvel, he was Mickey Demio. But there's Gene Colan, no more Adam Austin. And very soon on, he quickly would begin to own the Daredevil character. At the same time, he's owning the Iron Man character in early 1966. I mean, here's a really nice cover by Colan. Very dynamic. Look at all that's going on. The volcanoes exploding in the background. Look at it as a beautiful piece of black and white art. I'm not sure who inked this. I should have checked. I'll get back to you on it. But there's the color cover. Colan, right from the start, was very interested in Daredevil moving through the city, swinging on his rope. Look at how this image, inked by George Tuska, beautifully in black and white. I mean, that's a nice graphic design of the strobe-like figures that Gene Colan penciled. And again, simple coloring. This is not newsprint reproduction, but it's the best I could get. Keep in mind, folks, while it says a Stan Lee, Gene Colan, star-studded super thriller, you might think that means Stan Lee, quote, wrote the story and Gene Colan drew it. But without getting into too much about the Marvel style, this pencil page shows you that just like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and the other artists in Marvel, they would draw the stories out after some kind of plot conference with Stan Lee. There's no written record of any of these things. Phone call conversations, notes taken by Gene Colan. The bottom line is the Marvel artists, like Gene Colan here, draw out their stories like silent movies on paper, and then write margin notes for Stan Lee to then go in and put in the word balloons and the captions. So this is Gene Colan as a visual storyteller with dialogue and editorial voice and captions by Stan Lee. Once again, just Colan used photographs of acrobats. He studied film of trapeze artists, gymnasts, so that the motion he was able to get in Daredevil was convincing. It was both realistic and stylized at the same time, because look at this one panel. There's a gymnastic-like move to Daredevil, a torque to his body, like a ballet dancer, and yet it's also a violent fight scene. Look at the distortion and yet the realism in this Gene Colan figure of Daredevil, inked by Sid Shores, controversial inker. But look at Colan's page design of this scene, and with the guys that Daredevil is hitting as just almost abstract legs. I mean, whether Daredevil is fighting one figure on a page, you feel the motion in that art. You feel the batang, as the sound effect reads. But look at how beautifully designed and orchestrated as visual poetry a page like this is done. I mean, it's a one long fight scene split up, no panel borders. I mean, this is Gene Colan doing Will Eisner. And then the boldness of the Marvel coloring in those days. I don't know whether this is Stan Goldberg coloring, but just ponder what the audacity of Gene Colan's storytelling on this one page, and marvel, pun intended, at the boldness and the stylization of the coloring. This is pop art in its truest sense. Here's a Colan, I think, inked by Frank Giacoia, cover from April of '67. Summer of '67 gives us Daredevil's first annual, the king size special. The Marvel style wouldn't be reprints like over at DC for 25 cents. You'd get an extra long story with interesting backup features. This particular issue featured a story called At the Stroke of Midnight. Again, story by Colan, autobiographical, as you could see, meeting up with Stan Lee to discuss the next Daredevil story. So again, Stan Lee is writing the dialogue and narration, but this is Colan's story. Now, look at this photo feature that came out later, I think in 1969, I believe, but you know, it's roughly the same time. But there's Gene Colan. You're a triple terror because he was doing, you know, Submariner and Iron Man and Daredevil pretty much at the same time. But you should really track down this story and read it, because it really reflects, if you know the Stan Lee truth to what was going on at Marvel, it's yet another meta example of how things were done at Marvel. So it's a real oddity, but meanwhile, Colan is going all ablaze on Daredevil. Look at this December 66 cover, but look at the original that exists. Now that's a real bulky Daredevil figure, isn't it? Weird inking on the legs there. But obviously it was rejected for this one. Now, Colan had a habit of drawing those bulky feet, which a lot of people who don't like Colan always complain about. But there it is, folks. Size. They're almost like clown shoes. I mean, come on, Gene, we love you. But look at this beautiful abstract image when Daredevil's life force was trapped in Dr. Doom's body or something like that. March of 67, I believe. I think here we were June of 68. Interesting graphic design concept. Look at this full page. Interesting storytelling there. Breaking up a full page that way. I like when Colan used white space so dramatically in black and white. I think these are Giacoya inks. Look at this Colan pencil that exists in the best resolution I could find of Captain America in a boxing ring getting punched out by Daredevil. Wow. And an inked version exists, except it's not the cover that was used. They got Jack Kirby. This is 1968 to do this cover, which has become a Kirby icon. And yet it was Daredevil's title. It's really the only, you know, one-off of its kind. The very next issue, though, would debut a new logo designed by Jim Steranko, who inked this Gene Colan cover. It's a total one-off out of nowhere. You can see here in its beautiful black and white form. Yeah, but that logo didn't last long. I think it lasted maybe a year or so. How about this? Mixing it with a photograph. Pre-computer, folks. This is old school mashups. Ah, check out this cover. Yeah, notice the logo changed. Now it's like Roman, no longer italic. But how about that figure? So acrobatic. I mean, there's so much going on. The staircase, the figures, the spotting of blacks. Notice in black and white, the figure was changed, altered between this black and white point and when it got to the printed cover. Here's another dynamic cover with the stilt man. And again, look at Daredevil's right foot. It's almost a clown shoe. But hey, that's Gene Colan for you. How about this interior page? Now, you see, this is, another artist might have only handled this in a quarter of a page, but Colan told the story the way he wanted to and would indulge himself on a full page. I just love the abstract New York City buildings behind, but it's just another, beautiful combination of acrobatics and violence. Here's a very moody Colan cover, kind of predicting his Dracula material of the next decade, maybe. But here's some weird original that exists on the internet. Very low res, but it almost doesn't look like Colan at all compared to the finished cover. Nice. Now look at this Colan pencil. Really nice, right? I don't know who was going to ink it, because look at the finished cover by Marie Severin once again. Are you telling me they thought this was better than Colan's cover? Oy vey. Who's making the decisions at that time? Stan, art director Lee? Here's another take on Gene Colan's anatomy in a 1967/68 Daredevil pinup. It's out there, folks, but Colan makes it work, kind of. Now, this is another one of the black light posters, which I'm isolating here in better resolution. So you can see that it was taken from this comic book full page image. Again, it's not the newsprint, it's the harsh white reprint, but nevertheless, you can see that the original coloring is just the psychedelic, I think, as the psychedelic version. Speaking of psychedelic version, there's a psychedelic version of a 1968 Gene Colan title, Captain Marvel. What the? Marvel's space-born superhero. This is coming out the same time as Colan is coming out with Iron Man in his own title. So this Captain Marvel, this version, actually started 6 months earlier, in December of '67, when Colan draws this version of Captain Marvel in this anthology title called Marvel's Superheroes. Now, of course, Captain Marvel was originally used for a character created in 1940 or 41 or whatever, here drawn by the great C.C. Beck, I believe, did this cover, with the powers of all the Shazam names. Now, after Captain Marvel stopped being published in 1954, he wasn't republished again by DC until 1972. This is dated February of '73. The modern Shazam, the reason why he's not called Captain Marvel is because Marvel ended up owning the copyright after the 1954 character went into discontinuation. That's why Marvel can have a modern female Captain Marvel. But back in 1967, or excuse me, a year before, in '66, before Marvel did that Gene Colan version, other companies, in the wake of the Batman TV show craze, were using Captain Marvel, the name, kind of illegally, it seems. Well, this character, who when he yelled split, obviously you could split his body, a little weird, a little creepy. But this is why I think Marvel moved at the time legally to own the Captain Marvel trademark, so that they kind of had to put out a character, and Gene Colan designed him. Here's a nice opening spread. Frank Giacoia inks, by the way. And, you know, Colan is letting his freak figure flag fly, if I might use that alliteration, with his figures, his superhero figures in general. Captain Marvel had a cool mess. Again, I think Giacoya's inks are just too heavy for Colan, but hey, that's just me. There's a nice cover. Inks by Paul Reinman. Now, here's Gene Colan's pencil that exists. The inks by Reinman. He was a journeyman inker back in the early mid-60s for Marvel. I don't know whatever happened to him. But you can see Colan doing some figure work. What exists from this particular issue, the reason why I'm showing it to you is, look at Colan's original pencils that do exist. See, it's that figure on the upper right. Colan is trying to combine the dynamism of Kirby with this very ballet and gymnast-like movement. Look at that great middle panel horizontal figure. And then judge for yourself the inks of, I guess this is Giacoya again. Again, the Giacoya inks to me are just too heavy, especially when you look at Colan's pencils, and you can think of other ways you might interpret them in ink compared to what Giacoya chose to delineate. Again, I'm only showing you these pages because the Colan pencils exist, which are really beautiful. Again, look at that funky figure on the upper right. The people who don't like Colan would point to this figure and go, how can you like that? And yet, it's all has to do with consistency of style. If you're consistent in style, as Colan was a stylist, you can get away with it. And then it's up to the inker to interpret it well or not. And I think Giacoya fails him and us. And that's what got printed. Interesting final page. Colan's pencil. And remember, he's doing the storytelling as well. There's his margin notes. So Captain Marvel gets his own title after those couple issues in spring of '68. And now we have the controversial Vince Colletta inking him once again. And you be the judge as to whether you like Coletta's inks on Gene Colan. I mean, look at, that takes a lot of artistic balls to do the upper right panel there, you know, and I don't think Coletta's inks are sympathetic to what Colan probably penciled. I'm not sure who inked this cover, but more Colletta inks. Interesting full page. I really love the way Colan designed this punch. See, but when you look at the figure of Captain Marvel and you study those inks by Colletta, it's like, oof. Now, I'm not sure, once again, who inks this July '68 25-cent annual Marvel Superheroes of their anthology title, and Medusa of the Inhumans, created by Jack Kirby back in 1965. Here's a 1967 pinup by Kirby of Medusa with her power of her incredible red hair. But there's Colan's cover, and we got to see his version of the other Inhumans, like Black Bolt. So yeah, I mean, look at the Coletta face on the upper right. But you know, it was interesting just seeing Colan doing Kirby's characters. And I just wonder, with a more sympathetic inker, what this page could have been versus Coletta's very flat line, I believe. I mean, look at the torque and the motion of Colan's Medusa figure in the bottom panel. And again, I don't think Coletta's inks are doing that any justice, but there's a lot of beautiful motion going on that I think Coletta's inks just really flatten. I mean, there's a lot of majesty in a drawing like this that I just wish could have been inked differently. But nevertheless, I think Colan's design shines through. Remember, I said I love the Marvel stylized monochromatic coloring of the 60s. Again, I don't know whether this is Stan Goldberg, but it's just such a classic all green and yellow cover. Another Coletta inked job, although a nice zipatone job up there. And again, you know, you wonder what in the hands of another inker, you know, would an interestingly torqued figure that Colan was aiming for. Still, it's nice with the zipatone background and the primary colors. Again, look at the poetry that Colan is shooting for in a figure like that. Even I love the beauty of the scroll figure on the right. Again, Colan is attempting a lyricism in this superhero work of his, in motion and speed, that is a combination of ballet and gymnastics and trapeze. And even the flattening inks of Vince Coletta can't defeat the majesty of a panel like this. And then Captain Marvel gets to team up with another Colan character, Submariner. Yeah, that looks like Giacoy inks, but I can't be sure. Interesting fight scene underwater between the two characters. I mean, yeah, check it out. Full page. Marvel. Yeah, he was Captain Marvel or whatever. But yeah, how about that punch? Nice. Again, I can't stand the inks by Coletta. But I love the face of Submariner in the left panel from that angle. It's just so abstract and beautiful. See, who's ever inking Colan's musculature doesn't really know what he's doing, but there's still a power to a panel like this, even though it's not sympathetically inked. And then out of nowhere in early 69, Colan returns to Submariner with inks by a very classic Marvel inker of the day, Dan Adkins, who, when he penciled, was known for swiping other artists' work, but he was a pretty faithful inker to whoever he was penciling. And you be the judge of how you think he pulls off Colan's return after he hadn't drawn Submariner for a couple of years in a multiple page book. But there's some nice fight scenes. And I think this is a great full page that we can see in black and white, the pure inks. And I kind of love the stylized coloring again, old school Ben-Day dot coloring. It's abstract, but I think it works. How about the coloring on this cover? Close up of the classic torpedo bullseye. Again, you know, the inks, I think this is George Klein, maybe. But I wonder what the pencils to the Submariner figure on the upper right must have looked like. But you can see the amount of motion and power that Colan is attempting to achieve with these full page images like that. I mean, that's a beautiful abstract piece of work. But nothing prepared us who were reading Marvel comics at the time for when he would start drawing Doctor Strange full time in September of 1968. This was his first cover. Now, remember, I showed you this Ditko image, his last Doctor Strange from July of 1966. After Ditko left, other artists would do fill-in issues. This was actually Dan Atkins penciling and inking in June of 67, I believe. But yes, other artists bounced on and off, and Colan starts doing Doctor Strange. And who's inking him? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. Remember this lineup of inkers? Of Marvel staff, artists and freelancers and staff at the time. But all the way there in the upper right, Tom Palmer, inker incredible. I think at the time he's like 26 years old. He had just broken in to the field. And he's teamed up with Roy Thomas, the writer, who was considered Marvel's young hip writer at the time. And Palmer starts inking Gene Colan, and right from the start, we see a new vision of Doctor Strange. I mean, Ditko gave us his vision, which was like, what's the actor? David Niven crossed with Ronald Coleman from Lost Horizon, maybe. You can describe that close up. But very quickly, Colan would begin to establish his very unique looking Doctor Strange. And the inks by Palmer were incredibly sympathetic to Colan's pencils that we could only imagine. I mean, there's a classic Ditko Doctor Strange casting his spells. But Colan, again, very quickly, with his panel design and layout, which we're going to talk about further, establishes his own style when dealing with Doctor Strange and the awesome eye of Agamotto. I mean, that's an incredible panel on the right-hand side there. So very quickly, Colan established his versions of Ditko's icons and made them his own. And his version of Doctor Strange's ectoplasmic form was very cool. Look at what he does here with Tom Palmer with negative photostats of the black and white inked art, which were then colored to give you that kind of negative zone-esque effect. And I mean, look at the zipatone work Tom Palmer is putting in to some of these panels to give them another graphic dimension. And this work and these panel designs were blowing our young minds. I want to say that's Palmer's inks, but that doesn't quite look like Palmer, but maybe it is. Nevertheless, some of these interiors, man, are just wild and woolly. Colan is really just busting out, letting everything just fly. And it's really just a graphic explosion on Colan's part of dimensions. Keep in mind, in 1968, Robert Crumb is developing underground comics almost single-handedly, dropping acid and doing abstract pages like this. Now, Robert Crumb is the greatest cartoonist of our time. Let's not go into him enough, but suffice it to say, the only other place you could get layouts like this was in the early underground comics in 1968. But here's Gene Colan not dropping acid and giving us layouts like this. Steranko at the time is doing Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. with layouts like this that made you almost turn the comic book page to read it. But at the same time, Colan and Palmer are doing Doctor Strange's Other Worlds and Other Dimensions, making the comic book page look and feel dimensional. Neil Adams at the same time is doing Deadman at DC Comics and doing very psychedelic pages like this. But again, Gene Colan is right there with the greatest of them, Steranko and Adams, doing incredible pages like this. And just beautiful. This particular issue and this story has to do with Doctor Strange being transformed visually from this character to the man called Doctor Strange, wearing a full, very dead man-like mask. And there's the cover of that particular issue. It's one of Colan and Palmer's greatest compositions and works. I mean, there's the beautiful inks by Palmer and the zipatone and all the extra effort he puts into it to really make it magnificent and beautifully colored as well. Just one of the great icons of the era. I neglected to even go into so many of Colan's incredible splash pages and the way he would incorporate type into his illustrative design. And look at some of these past Doctor Strange. I mean, this feels like, remember, he wanted to be a director in film. It's pages like this that you can feel the kind of filmic cinematic effect of the lightning flash and the sound and the rain, and just the Doctor Strange figure totally enwrapped in his cloak. Just beautiful. How about this abstract page and the way Colan works the type into it? The Sons of Satanish. I mean, that is almost an abstract piece of art. I love the way it's colored. It's really just a beautiful page. This is really weird, this spread. Look, I mean, that's Colan pushing it, man. But really, it's just, again, just the audacity to attempt to pull something like this off. And they changed Doctor Strange's look to try to increase sales, thinking if he looked more like a superhero. Sales did not increase. So these last issues, while they would become, in retrospect, Doctor Strange's last issues of this Silver Age incarnation, nevertheless, Colan and Palmer artistically are just pushing the limits to what can be done in terms of movement, motion, speed, action, abstract. I mean, look at that figure on the right. Those legs, again, are abstracted, but it works. I mean, this is why you can put Colan's Doctor Strange on a level with Ditko's, because while Ditko was the first, he's like the Sean Connery of Doctor Strange's, and designed his own abstract universes, like his concept of eternity. Well, look at this weird Doctor Strange cover, May of 1969. Now, is that a Ditko Eternity with a Colin Palmer, Doctor Strange, with a photograph of New York City? Well, look at this piece of art that exists. Now, that's a beautiful Colin Palmer illustration. Now, whether it actually got colored or on the internet, somebody put this together, maybe. But it shows you what might have been and why this was rejected in favor of this weird, jerry-rigged paste up. Even the figure was taken from a different issue of Doctor Strange, where he teams up with Marvel's The Black Knight. Now, here's the cover to that particular issue. I like the beautiful green background and the almost cartooniness of the villain. But yeah, here's Colin with his panel design, beautiful Black Knight on the bottom right, beautiful Doctor Strange on the bottom left. I love how he again used the panel border to kind of, separate the action. It just works so beautifully. It's beautifully designed. And yeah, look at how, Colin and Palmer do Eternity. This image exists. I think this was the original layout. I don't think this was something he did later on in his life. I may not be sure, but that's a beautiful full page image, again, with the type worked into it. By the way, Tom Palmer was a great colorist. He might have colored a lot of these issues that he inked, but I kind of dug the Doctor Strange mask. I mean, I liked my superheroes a mask. Not that I didn't like Doctor Strange without a mask, but I was on board with this Doctor Strange. Look at the zipatone effects that Palmer would put into his work to give it just that extra dynamic edge. How about this full page? There's Colin Palmer's Eternity. Look at that coloring. Again, in black and white with the zipatone effect. It was made into another one of those black light posters. But again, it's like, to me, the original, I think, is better. Check out this full page and what Colin is attempting to do with vision and point of view and how it works as a double page spread. Look at the design of Doctor Strange's cape in the right side panel. It's just a beautiful work of art, really. This is Colin getting as psychedelic and abstract as the 60s went on, man. Look at the swirling. This reminds me of, Psycho, the shower scene when the close-up of the eye. Remember, this is Gene Colan who said, I wanted to be I was influenced by film. Everything I drew was like being the director of a film. Yeah, you get a very cinematic feeling from Colan's work. I just love the old school Ben-Day dot coloring, folks. Again, that could be Tom Palmer's coloring. But Palmer understood the nuances of Gene Colan's penciling style and achieved them like no other inker ever did, and I believe in Colan's career. How about this double page spread, folks? Now, again, it's psychedelic. It takes a lot of balls. And whether it succeeds or not, you just got to love it just for the audacity of doing it. But these are the types of stories Colan is telling, just letting layout feel the story through, and it all works beautifully. I mean, folks, stop and consider all of the motion that Colan is attempting to give you, the reader, the experience of this story that he's telling visually on paper. I mean, remember what Robert Crumb said, it's only lines on paper, folks, but that left page is a thing of beauty. The right page is really a thing of beauty. And it feels like motion, but it's not, folks. And that's the greatness of Gene Colan. He makes you feel the motion of his art, the swirling, gee, I'm at a loss for words. I'm just in awe. As I'm showing you this art, I hope you're sharing the awe I'm feeling just looking at these pages again and sharing them with you. And look at how he's able to bring it back to, again, a very cinematic, very filmic ending scene. This was really the penultimate issue of Doctor Strange. The following issue was to be the last issue, dated November 70, I believe. Or was it November 69? No. Yeah, November of 69, I think, is the last issue. But man, look at that great Doctor Strange figure. The spotting of blacks by Palmer, the zipatone to add another dimension. Beautiful. And the flying figures of Doctor Strange across this spread, if they don't make you think of what he would end up doing in the 70s with Tomb of Dracula, well, this is where Colan was kind of auditioning for the part, so to speak. But here's one of his last great Doctor Strange double-page spreads, kind of an abstract battle scene. There's a final pinup. Maybe the last piece of, looks like a Gene Colan self-portrait in the bottom right. I wonder if this is Gene Colan's own inks because he signed it. Could be. I think this is January of 70, maybe, or 69. I got my dates wrong, but yeah, look at that abstract Colan figure. That's classic. But again, looks like heavy-handed inks by somebody. In January of 69, we get, yes, is that the Guardians of the Galaxy? For you younger viewers, is that the characters from the movies you've been seeing the last couple of years? I think the third one is coming out next year, right? Yes, it got its start in this issue of Marvel Superheroes, the 25-cent size annual. Yeah, January 69. And written by Arnold Drake, who was a DC writer, created Doom Patrol and created Deadman with Carmine Infantino. Look at Mickey Demio is still using his pseudonym instead of Mike Esposito. Wow, that's late. So, you know, the inking by Esposito is okay, but it's, you know, not bad Colan work. But yeah, folks, this was the Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know what they did after this, if they did anything. But it was Colan's next project that would excite everybody when he did a stint on the Avengers in 1969, debuting this new character of Goliath. Goliath was Ant-Man, he was Giant Man, and in this corner, Goliath. Okay, we got it. There we go. And let's see, who is doing the inking this time? It looks different. Nothing like we've seen on Colan before. look closely at the credit. George Klein. George Klein was Kurt Swan's inker of Superman in the 60s, from 1961 to 1967. Many think he was the Joe Sinnott to Kurt Swan's Jack Kirby, his soulmate inker, and I would tend to agree. But in 68, he and a bunch of longtime DC staffers were given the boot by newcoming head Carmine Infantino, and that's a whole story unto itself. And many of them gravitated to Marvel Comics. And George Klein would end up inking GENE COLAN in 1968 and 1969. And it's a version of Colan's art. And maybe because it's the Avengers and it was the debut of this Goliath character, that people, fans, fondly remember Colan's stint on the Avengers. See, there's those very Sinnott-like bold brushstrokes of George Klein that worked on an artist like GENE COLAN, just like they worked on John Buscema, fellow Marvel artist of the second wave after Kirby and Ditko. There's a close-up of another Avengers cover. Nicely cinematic pace, very 2001: A Space Odyssey-esque. How about that double page spread? And with that great type, like a death ray from the sky. Again, Colan wanted to be a filmmaker. Well, there's your widescreen cinematic styling of GENE COLAN. And there's your George Klein inks and your action panel. Now, how about this cover with the character, the swordsman? Great coloring. Again, I love the more stylized, monochromatic coloring. To me, comic book art, the black and white art with stylized coloring, just has a feeling and a look all of its own. Dynamic spread. This is Colan inked by Sam Granger, who was a Marvel journeyman artist, penciler, and an inker as well. But how about this double page spread by Colan? Again, audacious, but very pre-Frank Miller. I mean, Frank Miller would end up doing stuff like this decades later. But again, that's Colan, the filmmaker, giving you a very cinematic styling. There's a very loose double page spread by Colan, inked by George Klein. After a couple issues of the Avengers, he then went to, yes, Captain America. After Kirby had drawn him for a couple of years, this is August of 1969, inked by Joe Sinnott. And here's finally Marvel's greatest brush-based inker, inking one of Marvel's greatest pencilers. Now, I happen to think they were not a good match, but listen, I love Joe Sinnott. But again, this feels a little too heavy-handed to me, but a lot of people love Colan Sinnott. And there's a lot of great action. So this particular storyline had to do with the Red Skull transferring his kind of life force into Captain America's body, and Captain America going into the Red Skull's body. Wasn't there a Star Trek episode like that, I think? But nevertheless, everybody thinks the Red Skull is the Red Skull, and he's trying to tell him, I'm Captain America. See, I think the inking by Sinnott is too, again, heavy-handed for an artist who's a little more realistic like Colan. But what's significant about Colan's run in 1969 is that he gets to introduce his black superhero, the Falcon. Yes, the Falcon. Now, if you think Stan Lee created the Falcon, well, you're wrong, because according to Gene Colan in interviews, he said, I came up with the idea for Captain America having a kind of a black superhero friend or supporting character or guest star who would be black. Now, Colan was aware that Kirby in '66, a couple years earlier, had created the Black Panther, who was not an American. He was an African prince, T'Challa, revealed here. But Colan was hip to what was happening by the end of the decade and the civil rights movement and everything the '60s represented. He would observe black magazines like Jet. Look, this is July of '69. And the very next month in Ebony magazine would be this cover. And Colan talks about being very consciously aware of what was happening in the black. Remember this cover that I showed you before? Well, notice there's a black man with a dog. Could he be blind? Blind like Daredevil? Yes, it's a great story where Daredevil bonds with a Vietnam vet who was blinded. And yeah, while I don't think the inks, I think by Giacoya are again heavy-handed, it's a great story. But Colan also had a facility for drawing black people that not a lot of white artists did not. This is a romance comic story that Colan, inked by romance comic artist way before Spider-Man, was John Romita. But this is again 1969, around the same time. Colan is coming up with the idea for the Falcon, and Stan Lee, and I guess the publisher, Martin Goodman, gave it the go-ahead. There's the ink cover. Look at the head was changed. That looks like a Maurice Severin Captain America. That ain't no Gene Colan Captain America. But the storyline has it that expatriate Sam Wilson is living in Haiti, and he meets basically the Red Skull without his costume, but that's really Captain America. And you can see in the beauty of the drawing, Colan knew how to draw black people versus just drawing white people and coloring them brown. And he talks about how he had the facility with training falcons, and that became a, quote, kind of superpower in a way. And Captain America decides, I can help you become a costumed hero. Oh, there's a whole plot there with the Red Skull's henchmen. But the bottom line is Sam Wilson becomes the Falcon. The very next issue, great cover by Colan. Here it is in black and white. Now, remember, these are not newsprint reproductions I'm showing you, so they're not the best, but they're the best I could get, and they still give you a sense of the quality of the art. I'm just a perfectionist. I hate the harsh white, but sometimes I have to use it. You see, I think Sinnott was too heavy-handed on Colan when you look at the musculature. You know, with the Jack Kirby, you can get away with that. But with the realism of Colan, I think it goes against Colan's instincts. But it's an exciting story. And look at that bottom panel, and then you turn the page. And really, this is, again, Colan, the film director, giving you that widescreen dramatic action. Yeah, so the Falcon is really the first Black American superhero of Marvel Comics. And here's, I think, the last issue of the trilogy where they finally defeat the Red Skull, put him back in get him back out of Captain America's body. But once again, look at that abstract psychedelic page on the left and the motion that Colan achieves in all of these panels. Nice close-up. The next issue, great cover by Colan, dynamic. You can see it in black and white. So this would be the last issue that Colan would draw, I think, ever, of his character, the Falcon. They get back to the city after their Red Skull adventure. And the Falcon goes off. He would continue to team up with Captain America as we headed into 1970. Not drawn by Colan anymore. I'm not sure who this cover artist is. So by December, I think, of 72, he gets a new red and white costume. I think in 74, he gets wings and the ability to fly or something like that. When Kirby returns to Marvel in late 75, early 76, he brings the Falcon back and teams him up for the next 2 years or so of stories. And then later on in the 80s, he would get his own series. That looks like a Frank Miller cover, I think. And in the 90s or the early 2000s, and in the 21st century, the Falcon would become a mainstay of the Marvel lineup, eventually winding up in films, of course. Anthony, what's his name? I forget his name. As the live action Falcon. They had that TV series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And in the comics, they seem to be merging the Falcon with Captain America as a kind of a combination character. I don't know. I don't follow the Marvel books, but Captain America in Colan's hands after they parted would go on to have more illustrated adventures in the early 70s. And again, there are fans of Colan's run on Captain America with the inks by Sinnott who really love it. And it's at a time when I think Roy Thomas is writing these, as you can see that he's making Captain America become very socially aware of his circumstances in the early 70s, the day of the anti-hero, the age of the rebel and the dissenter, and questioning his own identity. And this was eventually would become the Marvel Comics of the 1970s. But as the 60s and Marvel's ride to the top drew to a close, they would initiate a new fan club, Marvel Mania. Here is the membership card with art by Jack Kirby. Marvel Mania would mostly feature a lot of very great merchandise, especially these 2 feet by 3 feet posters of all the great Marvel artists, Romita, Kirby, Steranko, Herb Trimpe, Hulk, doing these giant posters. And there were stickers and other things. So there were also these cool self-portraits by all the different Marvel artists. You can see on the bottom right, John Buscema, in the center, Romita, Herb Trimpe on the left, Steranko, Kirby on the upper right, and yes, Gene Colan in the center with this autobio image of his Marvel Silver Age tenure. Marvel Mania also put out a magazine in 1970 that ran for, I don't know, 7 or 8 issues. But under this first Jack Kirby cover, look at the Marvel Mania logo. I really loved it as a kid with all the artwork of the characters inside the letters. So when I got to do my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, I got to pay homage to that. Here's a later issue of Marvel Mania, number 6, circa 1971, I'm going to say. And there, they used to publish fan art. And on the letters page here, what do we have here? Is that the Golden Age bulky Iron Man? Let's make it sharper. Is that Arlen Schumer, 1970, my first published art when I was 12 years old. That was me trying to do, remember this image of Colan? I must have had an affinity. Why I chose it, I don't remember. But yes, folks, this is my first published art under a Neil Adams cover. I would end up working for Neil Adams a decade and a half later. But it's a fitting way to bring the marvelous milieus of the Silver Age career of Gene Colan. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, I've got various pages like my comic book history page with information about my Silver Age book and how you can get a signed and sketched in by me hardcover copy. My book will change your life. By the way, underneath, on the back cover of the book are some blurbs. You can see there Will Eisner, Roy Thomas, Alan Moore, but who's that? Gene Colan. Through the years, I've had the pleasure of seeing many books that pay tribute to the art of comics, but Arlen Schumer has created an entirely new format in presenting the art and words of the artist. It's the most comprehensive and personal way a fan or colleague can learn what lies beneath the art. Arlen has found the perfect way to inform and entertain. It's simply awesome, and the best representation of my work ever. Folks, you know how blown away I was to receive that blurb from the great Gene Colan. And look at the spreads I designed. I only had 8 pages for him. I wish I had more. He had the least pages in the book, and yet he wrote that incredible blurb. But you can see many of the images that you've seen tonight. And again, on the right, I would take out the original word balloon text and put the artist talking about the art. So that's Colan telling you how he was influenced by Kirby to do pages like that. All of that text on this Daredevil spread is Colan talking about how he drew Daredevil, why he drew it the way he drew it. The text on the left-hand side and all those Doctor Strange word balloons is Colan telling you how fans at the time thought he was dropping acid in order to draw those psychedelic layouts of Doctor Strange. Folks, in the Marvel Masterworks Volume 4 book, came out circa 2007 or 2008, I was asked by series editor Corey Settlemeyer, who loved my Silver Age book, to write an introduction to those stories. And I can't tell you how proud I was to be able to have a little piece of immortality by writing an official Marvel Comics essay for them. Here's Colan holding a blow-up of his greatest Iron Man cover. My good friend Matthew DeMasi makes stained glass versions, poster size, of comic book covers. And that's his beautiful Doctor Strange #1. Colan's Iron Man has been merchandised in various places. This is art I see on the internet all the time. Yeah, Daredevil socks, I guess, right? Is that what those are? Everybody wants to forget the Ben Affleck movie from 2003, 4, something like that. But everybody seemed to have liked the Charlie Cox, was that his name? The actor who played Daredevil in the Netflix version, which I think they say they're bringing back in whatever they're doing these days. But you can see how Gene Colan's Daredevil really lives on as an icon. Some of Marvel's reprint books use that image. There's a Marvel Masterworks you can get. All of his work and Marvel in the 60s that I've shown you has all been reprinted. But like I always say, stick with the newsprint originals if you could find them. Look at this interesting Marvel Comics collection. That's actually more of an art book about his work. There's Marvel Masterworks, the Captain Marvel works. Here's another art book of Colan's work with a beautiful pencil that he did. of some of his great characters there. But I like this book that came out a couple of years ago, Secrets in the Shadows, The Art and Life of Gene, or maybe this is a version. Yeah, the other one was called Secrets in the Shadows. But this uses that great self-portrait that he did, which I also used on the opening spread of the Gene Colan chapter in my Silver Age book that I ghosted, as it's called, behind the type of my introduction in my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art, which I also run a Facebook group about. I also run one just on Jack Kirby's work and one on the artists that influenced me and really a whole generation, Neil Adams. My own illustration work, one of my specialties, doing comic book art for advertising and editorial usage and turning real people into superheroes, but keeping the kind of photographic look as well. My site's linked to a commercial site, TeePublic, where you can get over 125 of my illustrations and every kind of knick-knack, gewgaw, and application you could think of. My visual lectures and webinars page is linked to my YouTube channel, where you can see videos of my recent webinars and my past live visual lectures, as I call them, on not just comic history, but pop culture history. My Vimeo channel has all of my webinar videos of copyrighted and trademarked material that YouTube's lawyers seem to flag, but Vimeo's don't. And then, folks, if you go to my events blog page, I always post my comings and goings, whatever I'm doing, with all the URLs and info you need to hook up. So thanks again, folks, for being here on this webinar, and happy holidays and happy new year. And I hope to see everybody in 2023. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.